Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today we'll be talking to Olenka Forde about methane gas release pathways in the Vadose zone. What factors affect gas migration within the Vadose zone? How can we track where it goes, and how do we interpret those results? Answers to all these and more coming right up. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. Today, we have the pleasure of talking to Olenka Forde. Olenka completed her undergraduate degree at Quest University, Canada. She's now working towards a PhD in hydrogeology with Professor Uli Mayer at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And her research focuses on the mechanisms and geochemical impacts of fugitive gas migration related to oil and gas development. Hi, Olenka. Welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Wonderful. It is a joy to have you on the show. So just to kind of lay some of the groundwork for our conversation, a lot of your research deals with hydraulic fracturing and kind of some oil wells. Can you just give us some background information about what those terms mean and kind of what all of that does?
Definitely. So when you think about developing oil and gas, sometimes it can be difficult to extract that oil and gas. So you can think of trying to move through brick versus a sponge. So when you move through sponge, the gas can easily flow. So that's called conventional gas. But unconventional gas is trapped in the rocks, and so it is like moving through brick. So in order to extract those resources, we use a process that's called hydraulic fracturing. And when we do that, we're injecting a mixture of water, sand, and chemicals at a very high pressure to really just break that rock and make a pathway for the gas to easily flow through and be used at the surface. So hydraulic fracturing is really a process for oil and gas development that allows us to easily extract the gas.
And then how do the wells factor into that process?
When you've fractured the rock and you're extracting the gas, then you need to bring it to the surface just for the normal everyday use that we use for oil and gas, and you bring it to the surface through a well, and that well has casings and cement on the outside. There's various sort of layers to it.
And then those wells can sometimes get leaks in them, which is closely tied to your research. Can you talk about that problem?
So part of my research is looking at when there's problems with the wells. So the casing that is like used for the well or cement outside the well can sometimes have problems, and that could be due to corrosion with time or little cracks in the cement, and those problems can allow the gas that's being extracted to leak into the subsurface, and that's a concern for us because the gas could enter into an aquifer or the Vadose zone or escape to the atmosphere.
So what are some of the problems or risks involved with these gases leaking into the aquifers? Why is it so important to study that?
So the biggest concern is that the methane in the aquifer could react. So methane is not toxic in drinking water, but it could lead to reactions that generate byproducts that degrade water quality. So, for example, you could have toxic metals like arsenic that become released because of reactions with methane in the aquifer. And in the Vadose zone, methane at very high concentrations can cause fires and explosions, which have happened in some areas. And similarly to the methane emissions to the atmosphere are greenhouse gas concerns. So methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So over time, having a lot of methane being released to the atmosphere is actually a big concern for those reasons.
So then your research is tied pretty closely to figuring out where that gas is going and what we can do to ease some of those problems. So for this project specifically, can you tell us a little bit about what exactly you were trying to study in this experiment?
So when gas is leaking into the subsurface, the natural gas is made up primarily of methane. So essentially, methane is like a good indicator tracer to see if there is a well leaking into an aquifer. So we wanted to understand what happens to that methane once it's leaked into an aquifer. How does it move? Does it react? And how does it go from the aquifer to the vadose zone or to the atmosphere?
And you had a really cool location for this project. Can you tell me about where this aquifer was located, how you got permission to release the gas that you did there, as well as just kind of why you picked that location? So,
as you said, we were pretty lucky because it is obviously difficult to get permission to intentionally release gas into the subsurface. So the aquifer we went to has been used for a lot of controlled experiments going back into the 70s. So the Borden Aquifer is what we used, and it's very well characterized, meaning that because there's so many experiments that have been done in the past, there's a lot known about it. So it's known how much sand there is in the aquifer, how much clay there is in the aquifer, what type of natural chemical variability there is there. So all that information is really helpful to know for an experiment when you're trying to control as many variables as possible. The other nice thing about the Borden Aquifer is that it is mainly sand, so that helps with limiting the factors that could affect the movement of gas in the aquifer.
And it's on a military base, is that correct?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny to picture, I guess, doing an experiment with a bunch of equipment on a military base, but really it's just a nice open grass field with some trees around it. Once in a while you'll see some deers, but the military base, I think, was just not related to the experiment, but coincidental. The Borden Aquifer was originally researched because at that field site they had contamination from a landfill in the area. So that's why the area was historically researched.
That's really neat. Did you have to get permission from the military to use it? Did they, is it fenced off and you have to have some kind of pass to get in? I mean, what is that? My mind goes to movie scenes where there's, troops doing ground exercises or whatever. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, you definitely, run into military troops doing their practices on the field sites around there. But because this field site has been used for many, many years, the University of Guelph in Canada uses it a lot for their field schools and research projects, and so it's kind of been used so heavily that it wasn't as difficult as it would be to do a field experiment somewhere else. So they sort of have done a lot of experiments here, so it made it easier to get permission to do our experiment.
Nice. I just think that's really neat. So then, let's move on to talk about the experiment itself. Can you talk about the experimental design, kind of how you did your gas release and how that all worked?
Sure. So if you can imagine our grassy field site, we have to inject the gas into the aquifer, and the idea was to simulate a well leaking by intentionally injecting that gas. So to do that, we drilled into the ground and we used essentially long tubes that went into the ground, and then at the ground surface we had gas canisters with the natural gas that we were releasing into the aquifer. And we continuously released that gas for 72 days, and over time we did increase how much gas was going into the aquifer to see how that would change the response in the aquifer and the vadose zone.
So when you talk about this being an aquifer, I understand that includes both the water inside it as well as the ground around it. like, how close to the water were you when you were releasing this, or did it vary by tube? Were you worried about it, like, getting into the water, or curious about what would happen if it got directly into the water?
So an aquifer essentially is just a layer in the subsurface that has water-bearing permeable materials like gravel, sand, or silt. And as I mentioned earlier, at Borden, it's primarily sand, although there are some mixtures of clays and silts. So the layer of the aquifer is all fully saturated with water. And the vadose zone is the layer above the aquifer that is mostly dry but has some gases and some water around the solid particles. So we wanted to inject the gas directly into the aquifer, so it was going right into the water. But then we also wanted to see if it moved into the vadose zone, and then from the vadose zone to the ground surface into the atmosphere. So that was really like trying to see the bigger picture of where the methane is going and how it's behaving once it's leaked out of an oil or gas well.
Okay. Yeah, I think in my head, I always picture aquifers as like this big underground lake rather than just like water that exists in there.
Yeah.
From like textbooks, you know, like when they'd have the pictures of like a big underground lake. So
yeah, I think the important thing to really consider with an aquifer is that, especially with gases, you're dealing with materials like the sand and gravel and silt, and that can really influence how different chemicals behave, especially gases that have to sort of, move around and meander around those materials. They can't just freely flow through water. They have those materials in the way.
Sure. And then this is kind of a side question, but where are some of the places that the gas can go? Like if you inject it, what are some of the different paths it can take, whether that you mentioned in your paper, like oxidizing or just straight up escaping, or what are some of the possibilities for where gas can go when it leaks into the ground?
Yeah, so it's pretty challenging with gas because, like I said, it has to move around all these materials. And so when we think about, what's happening to the gas, where is it going, the first thing that will happen is that when it goes into the water, it will try and dissolve. And it will dissolve as much as possible, but some of it won't be able to dissolve because there's just so much of it. And so that gas sort of starts moving around in what we call the gas phase. And when you have gas phases moving around, you can have some of it going higher up. So like if you imagine a bubble in a soda can, it's trying to move up with its buoyancy. So when it moves out of the aquifer, it will go into the vadose zone, and then from the vadose zone it's going to keep moving up into the atmosphere. So that's the general path of the gas. But when the gas is interacting with the water and dissolving, it can also be degraded and oxidized. So the microbes are going to eat the methane for an energy source for themselves, and when they eat the methane, they produce carbon dioxide. So for us to look at carbon dioxide, that's a good indicator that the methane is being degraded.
Yeah, it's super neat. It's cool to think about something eating a gas for sustenance.
Yeah, well, I guess you have to think about that it's a gas, but it is also dissolved. It's not like the microbes don't eat like a gas bubble.
Right. Which would be very cute if they did. So
yeah.
So you had a couple of types of chambers that you used as you were monitoring this area. So you released the gas, and then you kind of waited to see what would come out of the ground afterwards. And you had 2 chambers to keep an eye on that. Can you describe the differences between those 2?
Definitely. So, like I said, we wanted to have that sort of bigger picture of what was happening to the methane once it leaked out of the oil or gas well. And when we injected the gas, we were taking groundwater samples, we were taking samples of gas in the vadose zone, and then we were seeing how much of that gas came out to the atmosphere. And the way we did that was by using flux chambers. And a flux chamber is essentially like an inverted bucket. So you can imagine going around the field site with this chamber, and it sits on the ground, and it sort of makes a seal around the ground so that it measures only the gas that's coming out of the vadose zone to the atmosphere. And the chamber captures that gas, and then an analyzer measures the concentration. And from that we can see how much gas is being released and the rate at which it's being released. And that gives us a sense of the methane that is being released versus captured in the aquifer or the vadose zone, or being oxidized, that's also emitted as carbon dioxide from that degradation. So the two types of chambers that we used were called a survey chamber, which is carried around the site, and that gives us a sense of the variability in the spatial emissions of methane, versus a long-term chamber just sits in one place and tells you over time how much methane or carbon dioxide is being released in that one spot.
Can you describe what these chambers look like physically? I mean, are they, the size of a small shed? Are they the size of an actual inverted bucket? I mean, are they easy to move? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the survey chamber that you move around the site is relatively small. It's kind of like half the size of a basketball, because it has to sit flat on the ground. So if you could imagine cutting a basketball in half and then sticking it on the ground, you're carrying that around the site to measure the gas coming out. And same with the long-term chamber that stays in one spot. It sort of has a round head, half the size of a basketball, but then it has attachments with it to help it stay on the ground and make those measurements, and it opens and closes automatically. So I remember one night going to the field site, and it was getting dark, and all these lights were on our field site, and the chambers were automatically opening and closing. It looked a little bit like a sci-fi scene because there was all this robotic stuff going on. But it's really cool because it allows you to leave the site, and those measurements keep going even when you're not there.
Yeah, that's super helpful. How did you decide where you were going to put either kind, I guess?
Sure. Like I was saying before with the gas and the moving through sands and clays and trying to sort of make a meandering pathway, because gas is moving around and it is variable, it's difficult to know where to put those chambers because you have no idea where the gas is going to come out. So initially it was sort of, I guess, like a shot in the dark. Where should we put these chambers and where should we measure things? But as we saw the gas coming out to the atmosphere, we were able to adjust where we were making our measurements because we could see there were certain spots where there was more gas coming out compared to other spots.
Yeah, that's super interesting because, you could be like 1 foot away from like
Exactly.
And you'd have no idea. That's a really fascinating challenge to think about. So thanks for taking that on. And then you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you were also taking samples in the ground for gas that would potentially get trapped by clay or what have you. Can you describe what those are like and how those work?
Yeah, so while you're looking at the emissions to the atmosphere, you also want to know what's happening below the ground surface in the vadose zone, because those gas samples really tell you what's happening before it's released, whether it's high concentrations of methane or the methane is being oxidized. So as I mentioned, when you look at carbon dioxide, you can tell if it's increasing above your background levels, then that means the methane is being oxidized and producing carbon dioxide. And you can also use what we call stable carbon isotopes, and that tells you how the methane is being oxidized with time as well. So methane has a light form and a heavy form, and the isotopes tell you if the heavy form is really sticking around longer and the light form is depleted, the microbes are consuming the lighter methane, and so that tells you again if there's oxidation.
Yeah, that was a cool concept. I know I had to follow up on that one for my lack of science knowledge, but I'm glad that you took the effort. I liked that a lot. Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Olenka's article, Vadose Zone Gas Migration and Surface Effluxes Following a Controlled Natural Gas Release into an Unconfined Shallow Aquifer, published in Vadose Zone Journal, is always freely available. You can find a link to it in our show notes. Let's get back to the show. Once you gathered all this information, you've been releasing gas over time, you've been increasing that. Can you tell us what you found? What were your results?
So the first thing that we saw was methane came out of the ground very quickly. It was pretty surprising with those long-term chambers because we could leave them on the site. So, we turned on the gas, we celebrated, got excited, and then walked away. And then we looked at the data 5 hours later, we were already seeing methane emitted to the atmosphere. And that was really surprising because it tells us that at our site, it was actually pretty easy for the gas to move from the aquifer all the way to the atmosphere. So we were looking at those emissions and seeing that. But then we also saw that there were what we call hotspots. So like you were asking, where do we put the chambers? Well, that was a pretty strong indication to us when we saw very high concentrations of methane or CO2 being emitted to the ground surface, that there was hotspots with a lot of methane going to that one area compared to other areas around the site.
So one of the things I like about this that you mentioned before is that you're fairly familiar with the makeup of this aquifer, but I imagine in other locations it's going to be a lot harder to predict those hotspots. So can you talk about some of the takeaway ideas that you got from your results that could help other people who are studying? For example, if they know there's a leaking well and they want to figure out where that gas is going. Can you talk about how your research is helpful in expanding to those other areas?
Sure. Like we talked about, that Borden is primarily sand. In reality, areas that have oil and gas development are going to have a lot more complex subsurface areas or aquifers that might have a lot more clay or sand, and it's important to think about how those materials are going to influence the gas moving in the subsurface. And so if you might see emissions on the ground surface and where you might see that. So it is essentially going to be very difficult because not only are you going to have the variability of the emissions because the gas is sort of intermittently coming through to the ground surface, but also spatially it's going to be difficult to know where that one spot might be. So like you said earlier, you could be 1 foot away from a source where there's emissions, but you might not measure that because you could have walked right by it. So when you're trying to think about monitoring gas on an oil and gas site, you need to really understand the subsurface materials, and you need to think about going across the site, taking as many measurements as possible, and also frequently or continuously taking measurements, because with the variability, you could go at one time and see a lot, or you could go another time and not see anything, and that can lead to both overestimation or underestimation of the amount of emissions you have from a leaking well.
Fascinating. What a sticky problem.
Yeah, it definitely is.
So that kind of leads us into kind of an area for future research, but what are some areas of this research that you see potential growth, whether that's better ways to map what's under the surface or better wells that are less likely to leak, or, better monitoring systems? Where are we going with this research?
Well, the development in the engineering and designing of oil and gas wells is definitely improving, but there's still always issues with wells that leak, whether they're old wells or new wells, and we need to understand why they leak and how they leak, but we also need to understand what's happening to the methane once it's leaked into the subsurface, and how can we monitor that? So before we can really start figuring out how to monitor everything, we need to understand what's happening to the methane and how can we trace it and how can we look for it. So that's important to understand, but we need to consider that it's also a very multidisciplinary research project that involves looking with different tools, whether it's, geophysics or groundwater sampling, or looking at the microbes, how the microbes change, or emissions to the atmosphere. So future research really needs to involve this multidisciplinary work together, but also on field sites that are, more realistic to oil and gas development, whether it's on a site with an oil and gas well, or if it's close to that area, because the Borden Aquifer was not typical for regions of oil and gas development. There's no oil around that area. There is no well on the site. So future research should go in that direction.
Awesome. And is that where you personally are headed once you complete your PhD, or are you going somewhere else perhaps?
I'm not sure what I'll do after my PhD, but we do have projects like that here where we're doing some research in northern BC, and that's the area of the research is very close to where they're doing active oil and gas development. So I'm excited to see what will come of that.
Yeah, that's super neat. So I have 3 questions left for you. The first one is, if people want to learn more about these topics, where can they go?
So, first of all, the paper that I published was only one of a few papers a part of this specific project. So, other papers like Cahill 2017 and Cahill 2018 and Steelman 2017 are referenced in my paper that are related to this project specifically. And there's lots of other research on fugitive gas migration and shale gas development that look at water quality impacts. For example, Vidic 2013, methane emissions from the oil and gas industry is a good paper by Alvarez 2018, and another general overview paper on oil and gas development in North America is by Soder 2018. So there's lots of good papers out there, but those are a few that will really provide people some nice background on that topic.
Wonderful. We'll include a link in the show notes for all of those. Second question is, if people want to get involved with these issues, where can they go to help? How can they get involved? You mentioned multidisciplinary research. What can they do?
Again, I'd say being informed. So once you are starting to understand the problem, and if you're interested in doing research, then there's a lot of universities that are doing research in this area. So if you want to be a part of the research, then reaching out and being interested. I also know that in the States, they're trying to do more work with people providing data from their local wells so that they can monitor if there's issues with leaking wells in the same area that people are using their groundwater wells. So trying to find out where they're doing research and what's going on is very helpful.
Final question for you is, what is one fun fact that people would not know if all they had was your research?
Well, I guess over here in Vancouver, we're right on the ocean, and I love to go out sailing on my little sailboat and explore the islands around here.
Oh, cute. I love sailing.
Oh, good.
I love being on boats, I should say. I don't have any sailing skills, but if someone has a sailboat and asks me to be on it, I will not turn them down.
Well, it's not difficult, so you should make your way out here.
Yeah. Have you discovered any new islands of note? Do you laid a claim to any, or have any favorites that you like?
No claims to islands, unfortunately. I think they're all claimed over here. But the Gulf Islands here are really beautiful, and I haven't seen any whales yet, but I've seen a few dolphins, so hopefully I'll see a whale soon.
Oh, fun. That would be a blast. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your efforts as a researcher. Best wishes on your PhD. And thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. You'll find a link to today's paper and other resources for this episode in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe, and don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes or anywhere else you find your podcast if you like our show. This podcast is a joint production of the Tri-Societies, the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by authors are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.